The air in the Grand Crystal Hotel is thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the silent desperation of those who maintain them. While billionaire Caleb Sterling storms through the lobby, his world spinning around a delayed private jet in a foul mood, Maya Reynolds is fighting a different battle. Her legs are failing after a double shift. Maya doesn't just make a mistake. She loses consciousness in the one place she is forbidden to exist, the billionaire's bed. This creates an immediate, high-stakes collision between a man who is everything but peace and a woman who is nothing but her dignity. The air inside the Grand Crystal Hotel was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the silent desperation of those who maintain them, creating a world where the polished marble floors reflected both the glittering chandeliers and the crushing exhaustion of workers like Maya Reynolds. Maya hurried down the busy hallway, clutching her cleaning cart with white-knuckled intensity as her hair slipped from its loose bun and her uniform showed the damp stains of 12-hour shift that was only halfway done. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night for 3 weeks because every time she closed her eyes, she saw the red ink on the hospital invoices for her brother Sam. Sam was only 19 with a heart that was failing him and a spirit that was the only thing keeping Maya from collapsing into a heap on the floor. Every double shift felt like a mountain she had to climb alone, and every floor she waxed was a few more minutes of oxygen for him or another week of the specialized medicine that kept his chest from tightening. She checked her list for the third time, seeing the gold embossed numbers for the Presidential Suite 1503, which was a crown jewel of the hotel, and the place where the most demanding guests stayed. Her supervisor, a woman with a voice like sandpaper and a heart to match, had cornered her in the break room earlier that morning, warning her that the guest in 1503 was a high-stakes investor who didn't tolerate mistakes or presents. One more complaint, Maya, and you are out on the street, the supervisor had hissed, and Maya knew it wasn't an empty threat because the hotel valued its reputation far more than the lungs of the people who breathed in its bleach. As she pushed her heavy cart toward the service elevator, she felt the familiar weight of the mountain of debt pressing down on her shoulders. She lived in a neighborhood where the streetlights had been shot out years ago and the windows were reinforced with plywood, but inside the Grand Crystal, she had pretended she was part of a dream world where money was as common as air. She reached the door of 1503 and took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling hands, because she knew that if she lost his job today, she wouldn't just be losing a paycheck. She would be losing Sam. The silence of the hallway was broken only by the distant hum of the air conditioning as she swiped her key card and entered the room that cost more per night than her family had earned in a decade. She began to scrub and polish with a frantic energy driven by the fear that the walls were closing in and that no matter how hard she worked the debt would always be faster than her hands. She moved through the living area and toward the master bedroom, where the sunset was beginning to bleed to the floor, the ceiling windows painting the room in shades of gold and fire that seemed to mock the gray reality of her life outside these walls. Her legs felt like lead, and her vision blurred for a second as she reached for a fresh bottle of glass, cleaner realizing that she was reaching her absolute limit. The mountain was getting too steep to climb, and as she looked at the pristine white sheets of the massive bed, she felt a wave of dizziness that made the entire world tilt on its axis, right in the center of the billionaire sanctuary. An hour passed before the heavy suite door clicked open and Caleb Sterling stormed in with his jaw set in a hard line of frustration because the board meeting had been a disaster of ego and incompetence. He threw his blazer onto a chair and marched toward the bedroom, intending to make a call that would ruin someone's career, but he stopped dead in his tracks at the sight of the intruder. There on his bed lay the girl from the hallway, the one who had ruined his shoes, and she was fast asleep, with a look of such profound exhaustion on her face that his initial surge of rage faltered. He stepped closer, intending to bark a demand for her to leave, but he noticed the dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises against her pale skin, and the way her small hands were calloused from manual labor. He watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, and realized that she wasn't being lazy or disrespectful, but that her body had simply reached a point of total failure. Caleb reached out and shook her shoulder firmly, causing Maya to bolt upright with a gasp of pure terror as she realized where she was and who was standing over her. She scrambled off the bed so fast she nearly tripped over her own feet and began a frantic string of apologies, while tears of shame and fear welled in her eyes. "Please, sir, don't tell the manager. I was just so tired, and I didn't mean to fall asleep. I'll finish the room right now. I'll work for free," she pleaded while her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Caleb looked at her trembling form, and the way she wouldn't even meet his eyes, and instead of the cold dismissal he usually handed out, he felt a strange prickle of curiosity. He saw her ragged breathing and the desperate way she was clutching her cleaning rags as if they were a shield against the world. He knew he should call security and have her escorted out for such a massive breach of protocol, but the memory of her sleeping face stayed his hand. "Get out," he said, his voice lower and less sharp than before, but still holding the authority of a man who owned the world around him. Maya didn't wait for a second command as she grabbed her cart and fled into the hallway, feeling the sting of tears on her cheeks because she was certain the pink slip would be waiting for her by morning. Little did she know that Caleb remained in the room staring at the indentation she had left on his bed and wondering what kind of life could push a person to the point of collapsing in a stranger's room. He sat where she had sat, and for the first time in years the silence of his well felt less like power and more like a void. The sun rose the next morning with a harsh glare that felt like an indictment as Maya sat at her small kitchen table clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee and waiting for the phone to ring with the news of her termination. She had spent the night watching Sam breathe through his oxygen mask and wondering how she would explain to him that their last lifeline had been cut because she couldn't keep her eyes open for 10 more minutes. When her phone finally buzzed, her heart dropped into her stomach. But the voice on the other end wasn't her supervisor's usual bark. Instead, it was the front desk manager sounding uncharacteristically polite and slightly confused. "Maya, you are requested back in Suite 1503, immediately," the manager said, explaining that Mr. Sterling had specifically asked for the same attendant to handle his breakfast and room service for the remainder of his stay. Maya arrived at the hotel with her head down, avoiding the judgmental stares of the other cleaners who had heard rumors about the disaster in the presidential suite, and her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the silver tray as she stood outside Caleb's door. When he called for her to enter, she found him sitting at a large mahogany desk, surrounded by 3 laptops and a sea of digital spreadsheets, but he didn't look up right away as she set the coffee and fruit down with meticulous care. The silence in the room was suffocating until Caleb finally pushed back his chair and looked at her not with the cold fury of the previous night, but with a piercing, analytical gaze that seemed to read the fine print of her soul. "Why do you do it?" he asked abruptly, and when Maya looked up in confusion, he clarified by asking why she was working herself into a state of physical collapse. Maya felt her defensive walls go up, because she wasn't used to people in his world seeing her as anything more than a piece of the furniture, but something about the stillness in his posture made her truth spill out before she could stop it. "My brother is sick, and the hospital doesn't care about my sleep schedule. They only care about the checks," she said, her voice cracking slightly with a mix of pride and exhaustion. Caleb reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope, pushing it across the table toward her with a flick of his wrist. Maya opened it to find a stack of $100 bills that totaled more than she made in 3 months, and she immediately tried to push it back, feeling a surge of panic. "I can't take this, sir. I didn't do anything to earn this, and I don't want you to think I was looking for a handout," she stated firmly. But Caleb held her gaze with an intensity that made her catch her breath. "It isn't a handout. It is a tip for the most honest moment I have seen in this building in 5 years," he replied, telling her that he wanted her to keep the money on the condition that she used it to buy herself one night of actual rest. Maya left the suite with the envelope tucked against her heart, feeling a terrifying mixture of relief and suspicion, because in her world, money like that always came with a hidden price. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, imagining the look on the pharmacist's face when she could finally pay for Sam's full prescription, but she couldn't shake the image of Caleb's eyes, which hadn't looked at her like a billionaire looks at a cleaner, but like a man who was finally seeing something real for the first time. Over the next week, the routine of Suite 1503 shifted from professional service to a series of quiet, intimate shared moments that began to blur the lines of the hotel's social hierarchy. Caleb started requesting Maya for every meal, and instead of working at his desk while she cleaned, he began to sit at the small circular table by the window, inviting her to share a cup of tea or a simple breakfast. At first, Maya resisted the invitations, feeling the weight of the cameras in the hallway and the hushed whispers of the floor staff. But Caleb had a way of asking questions that made her feel like her opinions actually mattered. He didn't ask about the hotel or the celebrities who stayed there. Instead, He asked her what she thought about the books he was reading or how she would solve a problem if she were in charge of the city. One rainy afternoon, as the clouds hung low over the skyline, Caleb pushed aside a stack of legal documents and asked Maya who she would be if the world hadn't forced her to pick up a mop. Maya paused with a polishing cloth in her hand, and for a moment she allowed herself to look past the hospital bills and the constant fear of eviction. "I want to be a teacher," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the pitter-patter of the rain against the glass, "because I think the only way to truly change your life is to understand the world enough to find the exits." Caleb listened with a stillness that was unnerving, as if he were memorizing her words, and he realized that while he had spent his life building digital empires, Maya had spent hers building a fortress of character in the face of absolute hardship. He began to look forward to their hours together more than his multi-million-dollar merger meetings, because Maya provided a sense of grounded reality that his life had been missing for years. However, the bubble of their unconventional connection was pushed to the limit when Caleb insisted on doing the unthinkable for a man of his status. He told Maya that he wanted to see her world, not the one she polished and perfumed for his benefit, but the one she went home to when the shift ended. Maya was terrified of the idea because her neighborhood was a place of peeling paint and broken dreams, a stark contrast to the velvet and gold of the Grand Crystal. She tried to refuse, but Caleb was relentless, his curiosity driven by a growing need to understand the source of the strength he saw in her eyes. That evening, he traded his suit for a plain dark hoodie and followed her out of the service entrance, getting into a nondescript car that blended into the shadows. As they drove away from the glittering lights of the city center and into the crumbling outskirts, Caleb saw the jagged edges of the life Maya lived. He watched as she walked through a rusted metal door with 3 different locks, and he felt a sharp pang of guilt for every time he complained about a lukewarm latte or a slow internet connection. Inside the tiny apartment, he met Sam, who was hooked up to a humming oxygen machine, but had a smile that lit up the cramped room. Seeing Maya gently brush the hair from her brother's forehead and hearing the way they joked despite the medical equipment surrounding them changed something fundamental in Caleb's chest. He realized that wealth wasn't the numbers in his bank account, but the capacity to love like Maya did, and as he sat on a mismatched wooden chair in that small room, he knew that he could never go back to being the man he was before he fell asleep in Suite 1503. The following morning, the sun filtered to the small cracked window of Maya's apartment, casting a warm glow over the kitchen table where Caleb had sat just hours before. Maya felt a strange lightness in her chest as she prepared for her shift, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of foreboding when she arrived at the Grand Crystal and saw her supervisor staring at her with a sharp, calculating look. The rumors were spreading like wildfire through the service elevators and the laundry rooms, with everyone wondering why the most powerful man in the building was treating a lowly cleaner like a guest. Maya ignored the whispers and headed straight to Suite 1503 to find Caleb, standing by the window, staring out at the city he usually controlled with a single phone call. He turned to her and without a word reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 secrets. He opened it to reveal a delicate silver necklace with a single sapphire that looked like a drop of the ocean frozen in time. Caleb explained that he didn't want to be a bribe or a payment, but a token of the connection they had found in the middle of their chaotic lives. Maya tried to refuse, feeling the heat rise in her neck, because she knew that wearing something so expensive would mark her as a target for the hotel's gossip and the world's judgment. Caleb stepped closer and gently took her hand, telling her that he didn't care about the rules of the hotel or the expectations of his board members, because she was the first person in years who had looked at him and seen a man instead of a bank account. He told her to wear it hidden under her uniform as a secret symbol that they were in this together, and that he was working on a way to help Sam that wouldn't feel like charity, but like a partnership. Maya finally allowed him to fasten the cold silver chain around her neck, and as the pendant rested against her skin, she felt a surge of hope that was as terrifying as it was beautiful. They spent the rest of the hour talking about her dreams of opening a small school for children who had been left behind by the system, and Caleb listened with an intensity that suggested he was already planning how to make a reality. However, the moment of peace was broken when a sharp, insistent knocking echoed through the suite door, and Caleb's expression shifted from warmth to a cold, professional mask. It was his lead assistant informing him that his schedule had been moved up and that a very important visitor was arriving at the airport ahead of schedule. As Maya slipped out of the room to return to her duties, She felt the heavy silver hidden beneath her collar and realized that her life was now inextricably linked to a man who lived in a world of storms. She didn't know that the visitor mentioned by the assistant was the one person who had the power to tear down everything they had started to build, and that the hidden token around her neck would soon become a piece of evidence in a trial of her character. She walked down the hallway with her head held high for the first time in years, unaware that the shadows were beginning to lengthen and that the fairy tale was about to face its harshest winter. The golden afternoon light was suddenly extinguished by the arrival of a woman who carried herself with the precision of a diamond blade and the warmth of an Arctic winter. Mrs. Sterling did not simply enter the hotel. She reclaimed it as her territory, her heels clicking against marble floors like the rhythmic ticking of a countdown clock. She had bypassed the front desk and headed straight for the penthouse level, having heard the whispers from her network of high society spies that her son was becoming distracted by a common employee. When she pushed open the doors to Suite 1503, she didn't find a business meeting or a strategy session. Instead, she found Caleb standing near the window with a look of peaceful contemplation that she hadn't seen on his face since he was a child. Her eyes immediately scanned the room for any sign of the woman who had caused such a stir, and she found in the small things a stray cleaning cloth left on a side table and a lingering scent of cheap lavender soap that clashed with the expensive air of the suite. Caleb turned to face his mother's expression, hardening instantly as he realized his private sanctuary had been breached by the one person who viewed the world as a chessboard. "Mother, you didn't mention you were flying in from London," he said coolly, but Mrs. Sterling didn't bother with pleasantries as she threw her designer handbag onto the sofa and looked him dead in the eye. "I didn't think I needed an invitation to save my son from a public relations disaster." She countered, her voice dripping with a polished venom that had silenced boardrooms for decades. She began to pace the room, describing in brutal detail how a billionaire's reputation was like fine porcelain, and how associating with a hotel cleaner was the quickest way to shatter it beyond repair. Caleb tried to defend Maya, speaking of her dignity and her struggle and her brilliant mind, but his mother simply laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made the room feel smaller. She told him that people like Maya were professional parasites who knew exactly how to play the part of the victim to gain access to men like him, and she vowed that she would not let the Sterling name be dragged to the mud of a tabloid scandal. Caleb told her to leave, but as she walked toward the door, she turned back with a look of predatory triumph, informing him that she had already scheduled a private meeting with the girl. She told him that she wanted to see for herself if this Maya was as noble as he claimed, or she had a price like everyone else in the world. Caleb felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach because he knew his mother's methods, and he knew that Maya's pride was the very thing his mother would use to destroy her. He tried to call Maya to warn her, but his mother had already made sure the hotel staff kept the phone lines busy and the service elevators restricted. As the sun set over the city, Mrs. Sterling sat in the shadows of the suite, waiting for the shift change, knowing that the most effective way to kill a dream was to show the dreamer that they could never afford it. The meeting took place in a secluded corner of the hotel's rooftop lounge, where the city lights looked like fallen stars and the wind carried the cold bite of the coming winter. Maya arrived still in her uniform, her heart hammering against the silver necklace hidden beneath her fabric, as she was ushered toward a table where Mrs. Sterling sat like a queen on a throne of glass. There was no greeting and no pretense of kindness, as the older woman gestured for Maya to sit while she poured tea with a steady hand that never wavered. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries, because we both know why you are here," Mrs. Sterling began, her voice as smooth as silk and as sharp as a razor. She placed a thick manila envelope on the table and pushed it toward Maya, explaining that inside was enough money to clear every single one of Sam's medical debts and buy a house in a town where no one knew her name. She told Maya that Caleb was a man of logic and numbers, and that his current fascination with her was nothing more than a temporary glitch in his high-pressure life, a symptom of man who had grown bored of perfection. "You are a distraction, Maya, and distractions are removed." Mrs. Sterling set her eyes, tracking Maya's every flinch with a predatory satisfaction. She painted a picture of a future where Caleb's board members would turn on him and his reputation would be shredded by the press, all because he chose to entertain the delusions of a hotel cleaner. Maya looked at the envelope and felt a wave of nausea because she realized that for the first time in her life, she was being offered the very thing she had prayed for, but the price was her soul. She thought of Sam's breathing, and then she thought of the way Caleb looked at her when she spoke about her dreams, and she realized that accepting this money would prove every one of Mrs. Sterling's insults true. She stood up, leaving the envelope untouched on the table, and looked the billionaire's mother in the eye with a calm that she didn't know she possessed. You think money is the only language people speak, but you spent so much time buying silence that you forgot how to listen. Maya said, her voice steady and clear. She told Mrs. Sterling that she was leaving not because she was afraid or because she was bought, but because she refused to be part of a world that viewed people as assets or liabilities. Maya walked out of the lounge and straight to the locker room where she turned in her badge and her keys, leaving behind the only life she had ever known. That night she packed a single suitcase and moved Sam to a small clinic in a distant county, leaving no trail and no forwarding address. She took off the silver necklace and placed it in a small box, realizing that if she and Caleb were ever to be together, it couldn't be as a rescue mission, but as a choice made by two equals. She vanished into the darkness of the city, leaving Caleb Sterling with a suite full of silence and a heart that was finally beginning to understand the true cost of his empire. The silence that followed Maya's disappearance was louder than any boardroom argument Caleb had ever faced, and it settled over Suite 1503 like a thick layer of dust that no amount of hotel cleaning could remove. When Caleb discovered she was gone, he didn't just feel anger. He felt a profound sense of displacement, as if the very gravity of his life had shifted and left him floating in a vacuum of his own wealth. He spent the first 48 hours tearing through the hotel security footage and human resources files, only to find that Maya had systematically erased her presence, leaving behind nothing but a locker full of memories and a vacant apartment. He confronted his mother in the hotel's private dining room where the air was cold enough to frost a silver, and he told her with a terrifyingly calm voice that she had underestimated the one thing she couldn't buy, which was his resolve. Caleb ignored his mounting emails and let several high-profile acquisitions slip through his fingers as he poured his vast resources into a search that felt more like a pilgrimage than a manhunt. He didn't use the police or the tabloids because he knew that Maya was hiding from the world of noise he occupied. So instead, he hired private investigators with instructions to look for a woman who was caring for a sick brother and trying to find work and education. Weeks turned into months, and Caleb found himself traveling to small towns and quiet suburbs, looking into the faces of every teacher and nurse he passed, hoping to catch a glimpse of the girl who had fallen asleep on his bed. He began to realize that Maya hadn't just left him, she had challenged him to see if he was capable of finding her without the power of his name or the reach of his checkbook. One morning in a sleepy coastal town 300 miles away, Caleb received a blurry photo of a woman standing outside a repurposed community center, and his heart stopped when he saw the way she held her shoulders with that same quiet defiance he remembered. He drove through the night and arrived just as the sun was beginning to burn to morning mist, and he watched from across the street as Maya opened the doors of a small literacy center. She looked different. She looked lighter, as if the weight of the hotel had finally been washed away, and she was wearing a simple cotton dress instead of the stained uniform that had once defined her. Caleb didn't rush across the street with grand promises or expensive gifts. Instead, he walked slowly and waited until she looked up and saw him standing there among the everyday people of her new life. Maya froze with a stack of books in her arms, and for a long moment, the world was perfectly still as they looked at each other across the vast distance they had both traveled to reach this point. She didn't run, and she didn't cry. She simply smiled a small, knowing smile that told him she had been waiting to see if he was the man she believed him to be. Caleb realized then that he hadn't found her because of his money or his investigators, but because he had finally learned how to walk in her world without trying to own it. He stepped onto the porch of the center and asked if she had an opening for a volunteer who was willing to learn how to be a student of the real world, and as Maya handed him a book, he knew that the search was finally over. The small literacy center in the coastal town became the birthplace of a new kind of power dynamic, where Maya was the leader and Caleb was simply a man learning how to be part of a community that valued character over capital. For months they worked side by side, and Caleb used his strategic mind not to take over a project, but to help Maya navigate the legal and logistical hurdles of expanding her dream of education for the underprivileged. He watched as Sam grew stronger in the salt air, and he realized that the silver necklace he had once given her was now back around her neck, not as a secret token of a hidden affair, but as a visible promise of a future built on mutual respect. The final transformation came when Caleb received word that the Grand Crystal Hotel was hosting its annual Global Impact Gala, and he knew it was time for them to return and face the world that had tried to keep them apart. He didn't ask Maya to go as his guest instead. He asked her to go as the keynote speaker to represent the educational initiatives they had built together. On the night of the gala, the lobby of the hotel was just as polished, and the lilies were just as fragrant as the day Maya had crashed into Caleb with her mop bucket. But this time the atmosphere felt different as the service elevators hummed with a new kind of energy. Maya stepped out of the car wearing a gown of deep emerald purple that matched the fire in her eyes, and as she walked through the lobby, the staff, who had once whispered about her, stood in stunned silence. She didn't look for the approval of the elite. Instead, she looked for the eyes of the cleaners and the servers acknowledging them with a nod that said she hadn't forgotten where she came from. When Caleb's mother approached him in the ballroom, her face was a mask of rigid composure, but Caleb simply took Maya's hand and introduced her as his partner and the woman who had saved his life by falling asleep in his bed. During her speech, Maya didn't talk about luck or fairy tales. She talked about the dignity of labor and the necessity of seeing the invisible people who make the world run. She spoke with a clarity that silenced the room, and for the first time in the hotel's history, the billionaires and the power players were forced to look at the world through the eyes of a woman who had once scrubbed their floors. After the applause died down, Caleb and Maya walked out onto the same balcony where his mother had once tried to buy Maya's silence, and they looked out at the city that now felt like it belonged to both of them. Caleb told her that he had finally closed the most important deal of his life, which was a realization that his empire was only worth as much as the people he shared it with. They stood together in the moonlight not as a billionaire and a cleaner, but as two souls who had crossed the greatest social divide to find a home in each other. As they walked away from the glittering lights of the gala, they weren't heading back to a life of hollow luxury, but to a life of purpose where every double shift was a memory of the strength that had brought them together. The end of the story wasn't just a wedding or a check, but a new beginning where everything had changed because one woman had the courage to rest and one man had a heart to truly see her.